Thank you for all attending today's session on criminal background checks and criminal guidance. Just a couple reminders, please leave your microphones and your computer screens off during the presentation. Also, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box and I will relay them to our presenter after he is done presenting. Also, again, after the session, we will have the survey sent out, so please give any and all feedback. If there's any specific topics or concerns you have, please let us know as we are trying to make these as best as possible. So for today, we have David Klein, and he will be presenting on criminal background checks and guidance.
Okay, Kylie, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I'm Dave Klein. I'm the Executive Director at Great Plains Housing Authority in Jamestown, and going to talk a little bit today on criminal background checks, giving some information on some do's and don'ts. But one thing I do want to make sure that people are aware of is a disclaimer, and that my presentation is a lot of information, but it is not legal advice. So I'm just providing some guidance. If you are looking for some legal advice or some specific situations or regarding some specific laws, do contact an attorney that has some experience working with these situations, as there can be a lot of different situations and laws depending upon if you're a government entity, if you're a landlord, if you're looking at fair housing laws, if you happen to be within the state of North Dakota or another state, there could be some differences in what laws apply to you. So I do want people to be aware of that. I'm not giving legal advice. This is some guidance and how to look at some things. We want to explore a little bit in what criminal history is, some do's and don'ts. Everybody does a criminal background check, whether it is housing assistance, employment, renter, if you're renting, people are looking at a person's different backgrounds. And so we need to look into how a person is doing that, making sure that it doesn't violate fair housing, that it is providing an actual service and not just being something that's intrusive to somebody's privacy. Policies will differ. I know a lot of places struggle with this, that each landlord or each agency will have different policies. Quite often, it's a question we get as housing authorities, is why the policies are different. Policies can be different depending upon where you are at and some of the situations that you may have. Some different funding situations may also provide some guidance on where do they want some funds spent. And so that can also change how you were handling background checks and what you were looking at. Although landlords are private entities, they are subject to fair housing laws. So it is something to be aware of, that whatever policies that you are creating do not create a fair housing violation or create a violation of somebody's personal rights. Examine what is best for you. Take a look at what it is that you are doing. Does this serve a purpose? Again, background histories are complex and can cause a lot of issues, whether it is discrimination or misidentifying a person. We want to be able to make sure people are using them correctly. One thing to look at is make sure that you have a signed consent. So if you are asking a client to have their backgrounds checked, if they're anyone over 18 or 18 or over, then make sure that they are signing a consent and make sure that they know what they are signing. It's often that we are caught with the very quick process that people are signing things without knowing what they are. So do take the time just to let them know why you are checking a background, and where you're getting that information. That signed consent means an awful lot, as some background companies may require more information than others. So if you're using a company to do some searches, that there may be some information back and forth. The other thing to realize is that most criminal histories are not sealed histories. So they are public, which means they're not going to contain or usually search by Social Security. You're going to be looking at names, date of birth. And so having a person's full name is very helpful. One thing that can happen with a signed consent, and you should ask, is if the person has had any previous names. It may not translate over to, if a person changed their names, it may not translate over to that the criminal history has changed to that correct name. So there's something to be well aware of. Do be aware of that most of the time, a juvenile history is going to be sealed, and a military history may be sealed, and something that you are unable to receive. Now, there are plenty of screening tools that people can use, and they should be using them correctly. Landlords and agencies have the right to use screening tools, but you should not make sure that they don't violate the Fair Housing Act and accidentally create any discriminatory practices or even some inadvertent discriminatory practices. The other part of that too is that you can't share these records. So if a person runs a screening search, you can't be sharing it with another agency. You can't bring it home and show your spouse, hey, do you know about this person? It can only be for that purpose. Most of these criminal or the background search companies have some specific rules regarding that. And they actually are going to have some specific rules regarding how you're going to maintain those records too. But remember that there are some protected classes within the fair housing laws. So you want to make sure that you are following those and not creating any discriminatory practices. Now, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. The act had two main purposes: to prevent discrimination and reverse housing segregation that was happening. It does not force you to take on people with bad histories. People often have this perception that the Fair Housing Act is making you take on people that may have bad histories or may take on clients that you're uncomfortable with. And that's not the case. It's just a matter of that you are needing to give everybody that fair opportunity to find housing. Now, there are two reasons why HUD may require a housing authority or a housing agency to deny assistance. There are actually only two that are federally. Now, the rest of them are things that a housing authority may put into place. So underneath HUD's guidance, that PHAs must deny admission to lifetime registered sex offenders, and also persons convicted of meth production and assisted housing without consideration of circumstances. So those two are a permanent ban. Everything else is a local control within that housing authority. And that is something that each housing agency needs to look at, whether it's the housing authority, a subsidized complex, receiving HUD funding. Those are the two permanent bans, and the rest of them are things that that entity will be looking at. So, and I have a misspelling in this, but housing agencies can have stricter policies. That is something that needs to run through their board. You may want to run it through an attorney just to make sure things are okay. You can ban specific criminal backgrounds if a person has committed a violent criminal offense, such as murder, you can ban that, but you must remember that things must apply to everyone. So it can't be something that a person disregards to help a particular person out. You must apply all those background questions to everyone. Again, not to create any discriminatory practices or impacts. The term that we often hear these days is called disparate impact, and it's actually an unintentional discriminatory practice that is happening, that a person, when you put into place a policy, that it may actually impact somebody that is a protected class. That it wasn't your intention, but it actually creates a discriminatory practice. So some of those things that the person needs to be looking at, does this, could this be a practice that does cause some discriminatory practices? So it does take some time to look through and read. So a couple of examples that we have seen in different places that people will not rent to someone that has committed a violent sexual act, such as rape or sexual assault on a child. These are things, of course, a person can have into place. We've seen some of these policies go in as protection. You do need to make sure that you are evaluating that policy, again, and having reasonings why. There are a lot of housing authorities and agencies that look at how many misdemeanors in a particular time or felonies within a particular time. Remember, if you are using a time period of 3 or 5 years or whatever it happens to be, that's all that you can consider when your policy is that. That doesn't help. So if a person had a violent criminal offense that happened years ago, you are unable to look at that or review that because of that time period. So remember to look at how you want to word things and policies. We've seen many look at, again, what is a violent crime? And some of them may have that homicide, attempted homicide, or manslaughter, and refusing to rent to anyone that may have been with them, convicted of those. One thing that we have seen used, not as that we have seen some people use, both landlords and some housing agencies, is that just looking onto a list and go, hey, you had some criminal, some background stuff on the history, and we looked at it like an ND courts. Some of those things happen to be traffic violations, and you can't use traffic violations. Let's face it, folks, a lot of people do have traffic violations. So if you would be denied housing assistance or a rental because you ran a stop sign, obviously can cause some issues. And that person can look at some legal recourse. You sometimes can use charges, although it's best not to look at just the arrest, unless there happens to be a previous criminal pattern of substantial evidence. Again, it's something that you want to be able to see what happens through this time period. And then if that person is causing any threats or abuse to another individual in that building or to the landlord, you need to be looking at what it is and how long it might be out before a trial. You can create paperwork, and you can always have things that you may refuse to rent to a person if they do not sign a consent. If it is something that you are doing for everyone, that everyone must go through a criminal search, then there can be that as well. So that's something to be very much aware of, that you do need to look at those, what it is within your policy, what it is written, and what are you explaining to clients. A couple of other ones too that I've seen in the last little bit here, as we've helped review some things, that some agencies had used 24/7 violations as criminal charges or contempt of court. Those are up to you. One thing about knowing what some of these charges are they actual violations that warrant a person not to be receiving housing or to have their lease ended. The other component is not to just look at that arrest, but whether or not these actual charges may change. So what a charge is and what the result might end up being could be completely different. If there happens to be a charge or an arrest record, you can request whether or not a client provide any additional support or the supportive services or additional information. Clients should have that ability to appeal any decision or any information that you're reviewing. Landlords can include costs in an application to do the criminal history. That should be something known and upfront with any tenant or potential tenant. Cost should be reasonable and connected to that history. So it should be only what it is charged for you for your time to connect with whatever software or provider that you are using to review those histories, and then a reasonable time in which you are to review it compared to your policy. It shouldn't be that running a criminal history check is $250 per person. It should be what is being charged plus some minor time in which you need to review that. Agencies such as housing authorities cannot charge those back if they're receiving public assistance that is part of an application process. It's kind of going through some things that always are best practices. Make sure your policies are written. It's amazing the number of times that we've helped out new landlords, working with new agencies or new employees, that the policies are not actually written. It is something in a person's head or something discussed. The policy needs to be in writing. All employees or anybody working there needs to have access to that policy and should understand it, and should know where to find it if they need to reference it. It shouldn't be locked away or hidden or on one person's computer. It should be something in which everybody has that ability to reach. A great practice that helps a lot of people and probably cools down some frustration is if any criminal history checks are available or that information is available on the application. So that way the person applying knows what you were looking for, may have an idea of whether or not they're going to qualify or whether or not that they should be providing any additional information. Instead of being frustrated that they keep getting turned down from certain items. It's best to have that information there. It's transparent. That also helps eliminate some of those possible fair housing issues in which a person might be mistaking things. And follow any screening policies. If you have a policy, make sure that it is followed. Make sure to quiz any employees to make sure that is followed. That information is so key that everybody is following through on things uniformly. Do also take the time to understand what it is that you're receiving from a company. So if you're using a service, or let's say ND Courts, that you know what you are obtaining, what that information is. Some national databases are able to pull from certain states very rapidly, and some cannot. North Dakota is one on several national databases that does not update on a regular basis. So something to be aware of. Those things they're part of a larger system. And so when you're looking at that information, but also know that, when you're pulling information, you're using it in a timely fashion. You're using it in accordance to your policy. And you're also looking at the correct person. So sometimes that involves getting that information, that critical information from that person about where they've been or any other names that they may have used. It's not uncommon to see very common names come across on a background history numerous times. That doesn't mean that this person was arrested 40 times. It might have been that there was 1 or 2 incidents, but that in that community or in that state, that this name may come up a lot of times. And so it is to look at that information. So an example, this one here just happened to be one that I had pulled from ND courts, and it shows that there are 3 charges: theft of property of 2 and false reports. There happens to be 2 of them were misdemeanors and 1 is a felony. So this is where you want to be able to look through, open up the case and actually look at it. Don't just look at this screen here when you initially type in a person's name, because this is the initial charges, not the result of what happened in court. What happened in court? Well, it shows you what the 2 misdemeanors and the felony C ended up being settled, and the felony was dismissed. So if a person would have been looking at this with some of the criminal history checks, you may have looked at that initial screen and said no, and not opened this up to see what really ended up being the result of that criminal case. And it's something that you need to be aware of, as many other states are also changing how they're doing some criminal history things, including in states where they are now waiving minor charges with marijuana and some other minor in possession type things, where they're waiving those. It's good to know if those charges happen to be dismissed. And so sometimes that involves you to look this up and check it out. The other thing to know about is that some of these terms are different in different states. So why they are arrested or what the charges are. If you have questions, contact your local police department to ask them, as they can help kind of guide you along on what this might mean, what it might mean in another state, or if there's something comparable here. Again, there are different things that can happen and carry over, and it's best to do your homework and look through. Housing agencies have a lot of compliance. Fair housing is one of many that every year that housing agencies need to be looking at, including Civil Rights Act, Section 504 Rehab Act, Americans with Disabilities, and Violence Against Women's Act. So there's something to know of, that we have to do a lot of documentation and keep that documentation. And speaking of that, the Violence Against Women's Act and domestic violence, this is a very, very delicate balance and a delicate subject, as domestic violence might be something that happens and one or both parties end up being charged. It can be something in which the party may not want to come forward, as there can be issues in trying to maintain privacy during this. So there are a lot of different things that happen within a victim of domestic violence situation. They are the hardest situations for law enforcement and for many other organizations. Working with social services, with child protection and others, domestic violence is a difficult situation, and it is a very delicate balance. There are a lot of things within this that people may need to dig and look if it is something that is public knowledge. There are some special forms and information for housing authorities to look at too, under VAWA as well. And just so everybody knows, although it is called the Violence Against Women's Act, that it covers everybody that is a domestic violence victim. So whether whatever a person's gender is, it does cover. Now there are protected classes under fair housing: age, race, color, religion, gender, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. You want to make sure that whatever your policies are do not violate any of these protected classes or single them out. The other one that gets kind of scary, or for people get scary, is the term is a reasonable accommodation. That may be just a person requesting whether or not they have some help with an application or an appeal. It may be requesting that a payee, a guardian, an interpreter, or another representative might be present in any meeting to help discuss any, what is being done or why a decision was made. Again, some of these things are scary terms, but they are really not a scary scenario of just adding in that option to make sure everybody is given a fair and opportunity with housing. We do like to see people have that ability to appeal. So in housing authorities, any termination or denial should include the statement that a person has and a right to appeal. Within housing authorities policies, you should have the number of days that a person has a right to request an informal review of that determination. They can explain why, they can contact the office, they can bring in other documentation. If a person has that ability, even with renting from a landlord, that they can appeal, hey, I think you've got the wrong information. They should be able to have that time period. Obviously, trying to argue charges or argue an arrest record that is lengthy is difficult. But if a person has the ability to appeal and work with some of the details or explain some of the details, or even just review what information it was that a person had pulled, that goes a long ways. So one of the things I like people to know is to think of an appeal much as if you're going to have to be, anything is going to have to be a legal documentation. So if a client ever requests or wants to know, be prepared to show your evidence or your criminal history report. Where did you find this information? Make sure that it is reliable documentation. Are the companies that you're using giving good information? Are you using a legal team to help you, guide you with what your policies were? Do review your policies. Is it something that needs to be changed due to situations within ownership changes or program changes or funding changes or economic changes? Or even demographic changes. You need to know what it is that your policies are. Policies are always meant to be changed. They're meant to be reviewed, not just be sitting there still for the next 30 years. You do want to give yourself decision-making abilities. So there can be some room in there in which you are making your decision based upon your own guidance and within your policy. That is not just yes and no. Hey, this person had, this type of charge. They brought in documentation or they brought in a caseworker. They are working with these things. Are there reasons to be able to help somebody rather than just turning them away? Give yourself that ability to make those decisions and document that. And create a timeline for a response. So if it, don't leave a person hanging out there for months on end if it's something where you are reviewing an applicant, whether it is for rental or for housing assistance, you do need to let them know within a reasonable time. Let them know how quickly that time response is, that you're going to review their information. Especially if there's going to be any appeals, they need to be able to appeal that within that time frame, and you respond within that time frame. Follow your screening policies consistently. This is where any company gets in trouble, where agencies get in trouble, is that people start making exceptions. And that's where you end up in a situation where you end up with fair housing or others looking at the legal issues. Follow the screening policy consistently. Again, if it's not part of your policy, or if it doesn't have a purpose, don't be doing things you shouldn't be. It has to pertain only to the reasonings of what you've outlaid. However, proper criminal background checks are good. They help protect the landlord and the owner. Obviously, the landlord and the owner have an invested asset, and they need to be able to protect things. Protects a housing authority and an agency that might be providing those services. We have to think of not just the program, but the employees that are working with those programs. It protects other tenants. You want to be able to make sure that what you are doing is helping protect everyone and providing a secure living space. It may reduce turnover as you're looking at how you're implementing your criminal background checks, that people know that things are being looked at, how they're being looked at, who happens to be within the buildings. It reduces law enforcement issues if there happens to be proper services tied to a person that may have some previous issues. It may reduce law enforcement issues by making others aware. And it protects everyone's right to fair housing opportunities, which we want people to know that they have. Again, this isn't a be afraid of part. We do understand that people need to protect themselves, their assets, their tenants, their communities, but to do it in a fair and consistent manner. Other checks that happen to be used a lot, credit histories, again, best practice, posting what and why you're looking for and what bureaus. There are different credit bureaus out there, and yes, their credit scores can be widely different. So that is something to be aware of. There is a big difference also between no credit history and poor credit history. Poor credit history, people who have not paid their bills timely. Remember, credit history largely is dependent upon how well you pay your bills. So that is something in which poor credit history is somebody has not been paying things on time or not paying at all. A no credit history could be a new college grad or somebody that is new to the country, where they have yet to establish their own separate credit. That's not a bad thing. That just means that they have not had that ability to yet establish credit. Just to understand that those are different things. Rental history, again, looking at timeline, what is documented, what is needed. Always look at things as kind of a court case. So what is good evidence and holds up? A person can always, file a complaint or file a legal lawsuit or, treat this as that there is something gone wrong if the person running these rental histories and other things is not doing them in a consistent manner. So it's something to be aware of. Again, have policies, train employees on the policy. Make sure everybody's understanding. If needed, make sure it's at somebody's table. Make sure that everybody knows where it might be stored. Do take the time to review it so that way people know. give applicants full disclosure of that policy. I, understand some people may not read things, may not understand the situations, but it does give everybody that disclosure of what your policies are, why you're doing that. Understand your resources. So what it is that you are using for services. Do they have those limitations? Are they pulling accurate information? Are they pulling information in a timely fashion? Are you pulling the right person with the right name? Inconsistent enforcement. Again, policies need to be enforced consistently. The second a person starts looking at doing things differently outside of that, either you should be changing your policy or you're going to end up in some issues with clients. The consistency part is the one that usually gets people. So with that, again, kind of a brief overview of criminal history. One of the things I can speak to as a housing provider is that we do have our own history policies and how we review things, how we look at things. We do a lot with appeals and working with landlords and working with appeals and trying to provide those services, those connective services. I can tell you in previous work history, working with the state of North Dakota, people do need to be aware of that name changes can happen. That throws a lot of things off. So do ask if they had any other previous names. If a person does not list them and you find out that there was a different name to it, obviously that's fraud. But you do need to know that can change, and people can change their names. They can change other identifiers. So you do need to be aware of those things and how you're going to utilize these resources. And there's also some different backgrounds when a person is looking at, are you looking at local records, state records, national records? Are you reviewing by Social Security numbers to see if there's other name changes? Those types of things need to be looked at. But whatever you do with criminal history, it's best to have policies and practices that are practical, that are understandable by your employees, that everybody can execute evenly, and that follow with whatever systems and companies that you are using to help you with those backgrounds. So with that, I hope that it helped with some information on criminal histories, what you need to be looking for, and why a lot of times it is that you should be digging down a little bit more into that information that might be provided to you. From that, we can look at the questions.
All right, we have a few so far. This first one comes from the beginning of the presentation, or towards the beginning of the presentation. Why does it say without consideration of circumstances? It almost sounds like a way out for someone if they say, oh, I didn't think about others in the building, basically justifying them making it.
Okay, so I know which slide it is. I'm going to back up to this one. And this is actually the HUD housing policies without the consideration of circumstances, I believe is the one. This is actually HUD language. And so these are two histories in which HUD says, no, not providing housing assistance to. If it happens to be convicted within the name of that applicant. So there isn't an appeal.
Okay. What is 24/7 violations?
A 27/4 violation is if a person needs to be checking in with the police department once a day or within every 24 hours, 7 days a week. If they happen to be required to be reporting into parole and violate that, that's what that violation is. And yes, they can be picked up and put in jail for charges on it.
Okay. Are repeat DUIs considered traffic violation?
So in North Dakota, there is a point, and it's not, and I'm trying to think if it's the fourth or fifth where it becomes a non-traffic, it becomes a felony. That becomes, at that point, that becomes your own policy on how you're going to handle that. States have different rules on DUIs when they become a felony or when they become something separate from DUIs.
Okay. When you mentioned traffic violations don't count, I am curious if there is a limit. For instance, I know a guy that hit a woman and almost killed her. He received a DUI and jail time. So curious if he is still able to rent.
Well, that would be, and I can't say because of legal advice, but that can be an entirely different circumstance of where you're looking at what the situation was. So was it manslaughter or any other charges that happened? Traffic violations, what I'm looking at with that is speeding, running stop signs, those types of things. Parking violations, those are things that should not be counted against a person. Again, sometimes terminology is difficult as it can be very vague. When you're looking at no traffic violations, what is a traffic violation? Were there other things tied to it? But some of those minor offenses of them, like I said, speeding ticket, those types of things shouldn't be something that's counted against a person. But that is your entity's policy, procedures, and something to review.
What are the time limits on felonies and bad rental history? How much time should pass before we disregard these when we are deciding to rent to someone?
That is going to depend upon your agency and what you're going to look at, or your company. There isn't a set in stone time frame that can depend upon people. I know that changes, and some organizations will say that no more than 5 years, but that is something to look at on your own, what you want to set.
Do the bans on renting to lifetime registered sex offenders and individuals with meth production in the housing apply to all federally subsidized housing or only HUD subsidized housing?
I believe that is only HUD. I don't believe USDA has that one. I don't know offhand, but I don't believe USDA has that.
Who sets each housing authority's policies?
So housing authorities' policies are created by that agency. So typically the director will take a look at and what policies might be needed. They have to be voted on by their board and approved. So that is who sets those policies per each housing authority.
When someone is porting a voucher, do they have to fit the policies of the housing authority that you are moving to?
Yes. So despite that a person may be qualified in my jurisdiction, if they move to another state and they have a different policy there, that housing authority has the right to deny them.
Is there an exact time for tenants whom establish residency? For example, is it 30 days, 6 months, a year?
is that looking at, well, for housing assistance, HUD does not have a guideline on residency. They, for portability or something like that, they will look at that they want you to be residing within the jurisdiction for 1 year. In the state of North Dakota, they look at residency within a certain time frame before you're having to change your ID. The two are not the same. So that does cause a lot of confusion if you're looking at programs versus state law. If you're dealing with the federal program, their rules are going to be different than a state law for residency. However, you are dealing with that program's regulations.
Can you be denied to rent an apartment if you have no credit history?
I've heard of people being denied with no credit history. Whether or not that is something that should happen is a different question. If a person is looking at whether they should create a policy to deny somebody, that's a legal question. We have heard of and seen of people needing co-signers because they have no credit history.
Okay, and then back to the very first question, as far as why does it say without consideration of circumstances? I guess she was wanting some clarification. Vicky, if you're still on, do you want to just hop on your microphone and ask your question?
I just retyped what I wanted to try to understand. So I'm guessing when it says without consideration of the circumstances, they're meaning that HUD or whoever doesn't look at it and go, okay, well, we can make an exception because of this circumstance. It's not that the meth maker can say, well, I didn't think about who it was going to hurt, and then therefore I should be accepted.
Right.
So,
HUD has made the policy that, and this is a federal one, so it's made the policy that, you know, they're not there's no consideration of you know, an appeal to those ones. Yeah, unfortunately, if a person is caused either one or either, you know, underneath either one of those, it can make that entire household ineligible. So it can afflict somebody else.
Another question came in. Who can co-sign for someone applying for an apartment?
That is going to be a landlord decision on who can co-sign. Obviously, it's much like co-signing a loan, and that person's got to be vetted as well.
Are there any more questions? If a child commits a crime, is the whole family evicted? If the child being 18 and still living there commits a crime, is the whole family evicted?
That is going to be a case-by-case situation. If the person is convicted and not going to be part of the household, there is a chance that the rest of the household, if there's another adult in there. But the landlord can make a decision based on their own leases and policies to evict based on that there was criminal activity. So there's multiple sides to that, and that one would be looking at what an existing policy is, if they're on assistance, and what legal advice a person would be given.
Are there any more questions? We got a few minutes left. I just want to make sure all the questions get asked that want to.
Well, I think one thing I will mention really quick, just for people's knowledge, and I will try to get this to Marilyn as well, so when it gets emailed out. There is a High Plains Fair Housing Center has a fact sheet on fair housing and criminal background screening that is available on their website. It's a PDF, and I think what three or 4 pages long. It gives some good information for people to help evaluate what their policies are, why that they should be having background screenings, and what they can do with it.
All right. Well, there doesn't seem to be any more questions. Thank you, David, again, for taking time out of your busy schedule and presenting to our group. Thank you all again for attending today's session. Again, please fill out that survey and leave any specific feedback or topics that you would like seen or heard, I guess. We have a couple weeks left in June, and then we will be taking a break and continue this back up in the fall. So any topics we're willing to hear about. So please be specific on your survey, and we will hopefully see all of you or hear from all of you next week. Thank you again for attending.